In 1999, two dive buddies from Clarkston planned a weekend spearfishing trip to Lake Coeur d'Alene, checking in at a campground Friday evening and launching their boat Saturday at dawn. 16 years later, a volunteer restoring the campground's logbook for the County Historical Society noticed that the men had signed out Sunday at 6:22 a.m., but the harbor master's launch log showed their boat leaving the water at 9:40 p.m. Saturday, a 3-hour window during which one of the men called his ex-wife from a payphone 40 miles inland and asked her a question about their daughter that she would later describe as impossible for him to know unless he'd been inside our house that morning. The two men were named Derek Moss and J.T. Caldwell. Derek was 34, a machinist at a paper mill in Lewiston. J.T. was 37, a part-time electrician who'd worked with Derek at the same mill until 1997. They'd been diving together since the early 90s, mostly in rivers and lakes within a 2-hour drive of Clarkston. They left Clarkston at 4:15 p.m. on Friday, September 10th, in Derek's truck, a 1995 Chevrolet Silverado, blue, with a white camper shell. The drive to Lake Coeur d'Alene took just under 3 hours. They arrived at Pinewood Shores Campground at 7:03 p.m. and checked in at the office. The clerk, a college student named Amy Brennan, remembered them because Derek had paid in cash and had asked if the campground had a payphone. She'd told him there was one near the restrooms, 50 yards from the office. Derek and J.T. set up a tent at Site 14, a gravel pad with a picnic table and a fire ring, 20 yards from the lake. They unloaded their gear, 2 spear guns, 2 sets of fins and masks, a cooler, 2 sleeping bags, and a canvas duffel. The site next to theirs, Site 15, was occupied by a family with 2 small children. The father, a man named Glenn Hoffman, would later tell investigators that Derek and J.T. had been polite but quiet, and that they'd gone to bed around 10 p.m. without building a fire. Saturday morning, Derek and J.T. walked to the marina at 5:47 a.m. The harbor master, a retired logger named Pete Rucker, was already at the dock. They rented a 14-foot aluminum john boat with a 15-horsepower outboard. Pete wrote their names in the launch log and noted the time, 5:52 a.m. He asked when they planned to return, and Derek said they'd be back by dark. The lake was calm. The air temperature was 52 degrees. Derek steered the boat northeast, toward a submerged rock formation Pete had marked on a laminated map he kept at the rental counter. J.T. sat in the bow with the spear guns across his lap. At 7:14 a.m., a fisherman named Carl Voss saw the john boat anchored near the north shore, about 2 miles from the marina. Carl was trolling for trout and waved as he passed. He noticed that one man was in the water and the other was sitting in the boat, leaning over the gunwale. Carl continued north and didn't see the boat again. At 11:20 a.m., a park ranger named Linda Sawyer was patrolling the east side of the lake in a pontoon boat. She saw the john boat drifting near a cluster of deadfall trees, the motor off, no one visible. She approached and called out. Derek surfaced 15 feet from the boat, pulled his mask off, and told her they were fine. Linda asked if they needed anything, and Derek said no. She noted the exchange in her daily log and moved on. At 2:35 p.m., Glenn Hoffman walked down to the lake to check on his kids, who were playing in the shallows near Site 14. He saw Derek and J.T.'s boat tied to a small dock that served Sites 12 through 16. Both men were unloading gear into a plastic bin. Glenn waved, and Derek waved back. Glenn returned to his campsite. At 4:50 p.m., Amy Brennan was walking to the restroom when she saw Derek standing at the payphone near the office. She didn't hear what he was saying, but she remembered that the call lasted less than a minute. Derek hung up, looked at the phone for several seconds, then walked back toward Site 14. At 6:08 p.m., Glenn Hoffman saw Derek and J.T. loading their gear into Derek's truck. Glenn asked if they were leaving early, and JT said they decided to head out that evening instead of staying another night. Glenn said goodbye and went back to cooking dinner. At 6:34 p.m., Derek and JT returned the John boat to Pete Rucker. Pete noted the time in the launch log, 6:34 p.m. He asked how the fishing had been, and JT said it had been slow. Pete inspected the boat, found no damage, and told them they were good to go. Derek and JT walked back to the parking lot. At 9:40 p.m., Pete was closing the marina office when he noticed the John boat was still tied to the rental dock. He checked the log and saw that he'd written 6:34 p.m. for the return time. He assumed he'd forgotten to move the boat to the storage rack and did so before locking up. But the launch log wasn't the only record of that evening. A receipt printer at the marina automatically generated a time-stamped slip for every rental return. The slip for Derek and JT's boat was time-stamped 9:40 p.m., not 6:34 p.m. Pete had written the wrong time in the log, either by mistake or because he'd backdated the entry to match when he thought they'd returned. At 11:50 p.m. on Saturday, a collect call was placed from a payphone at a rest area on Interstate 90, 43 miles south of Lake Coeur d'Alene. The call was made to a residential number in Clarkston, registered to a woman named Brenda Moss, Derek's ex-wife. The call lasted 2 minutes and 18 seconds. Brenda would later tell investigators that Derek had asked her a single question: "Does Kayla still keep her retainer case on the bathroom counter, or did you move it?" Brenda had been confused. She'd told Derek that Kayla had only gotten the retainer case 3 days earlier, on Wednesday, and that it was sitting on the counter in the upstairs bathroom. Derek had said okay and hung up. Brenda thought the call was strange, but didn't dwell on it. Derek had visitation rights and occasionally asked about details related to their daughter, though the question about the retainer case seemed oddly specific. She went to bed and didn't think about it again until Monday. On Sunday, September 12th, at 6:22 a.m., Derek and JT signed out of Pinewood Shores campground. The checkout log was a spiral notebook kept on the counter in the office. Campers were supposed to sign out before leaving, but the office wasn't staffed on Sunday mornings, so the notebook was left on the counter with a pen. Derek's signature appeared on line 14, followed by JT's on line 15. Both entries were dated September 12th, and the time written next to Derek's name was 6:22 a.m. At 8:45 a.m., Glenn Hoffman packed up his campsite and noticed that Site 14 was empty. He assumed Derek and JT had left early. He signed out at 9:10 a.m. and drove home to Spokane. On Monday, September 13th, Brenda Moss called Derek's apartment in Clarkston. There was no answer. She called again on Tuesday and Wednesday and got no answer. On Thursday, she called Derek's supervisor at the paper mill. The supervisor said Derek hadn't shown up for his shift on Monday or Tuesday, and that he'd been marked as a no-call, no-show. The supervisor had tried calling Derek's apartment and had gotten no answer. Brenda called the Clarkston Police Department and filed a missing person report. A patrol officer went to Derek's apartment and found it locked. The landlord let the officer inside. The apartment was tidy. There was mail on the counter, dated through Saturday, September 11th. Derek's bed was made. His wallet and keys were not in the apartment. The officer called J.T. Caldwell's last known number, a landline registered to an address in Lewiston. The phone rang, but no one answered. The officer drove to the address and found that J.T. had moved out 3 months earlier. The landlord said J.T. had paid through the end of his lease in August and had left a forwarding address in Coeur d'Alene. The officer contacted the Coeur d'Alene Police Department and requested a welfare check. A patrol officer visited the forwarding address, a small rental house on the north side of town. The house was occupied by a couple who said they'd moved in at the beginning of September and had never heard of J.T. Caldwell. On Friday, September 17th, Brenda Moss received a postcard in the mail. It was postmarked from Missoula, Montana, dated September 14th. The front of the card showed a generic image of a mountain lake. The back had a short message written in block letters. "Kayla will understand when she's older. Don't look for me." The card was not signed. Brenda took the postcard to the Clarkston Police Department. A detective named Ray Hollis compared the handwriting to samples of Derek's writing from his employment records and his lease agreement. The handwriting did not match. The block letters were too uniform, as if someone had deliberately disguised their natural hand. Hollis contacted the Missoula Police Department and requested surveillance footage from post offices in the area for September 13th and 14. The Missoula PD said footage was only retained for 72 hours and had already been overwritten. On September 20th, Hollis drove to Pinewood Shores Campground and interviewed Amy Brennan and Pete Rucker. Amy remembered Derek and JT, but had no additional details. Pete showed Hollis the launch log and the marina receipt. Hollis noticed the discrepancy between the handwritten return time and the time-stamped receipt. Hollis asked Pete if he was certain Derek and JT had returned the boat at 6:34 p.m. Pete said he'd written that time in the log, but admitted he might have made a mistake. He said it was possible he'd been distracted and had written the time they'd said they would return, rather than the time they actually did. Hollis examined the receipt. The timestamp was clear, 9:40 p.m. Hollis asked Pete if anyone else had access to the marina that evening. Pete said no. He'd been the only one there, and he'd locked up at 10:15 p.m. Hollis requested phone records for the payphone at the rest area on Interstate 90. The phone company provided a log showing that a collect call had been placed to Brenda Moss's number at 11:50 p.m. on September 11th. The call had been accepted and had lasted 2 minutes and 18 seconds. Hollis calculated the drive time from Pinewood Shores to the rest area. At highway speeds, the trip would take approximately 38 minutes. If Derek had left the campground at 6:34 p.m., as the launch log suggested, he would have arrived at the rest area by 7:15 p.m., but the call had been placed at 11:50 p.m., more than 4 hours later. Hollis requested toll records for Interstate 90. There were no tolls on that stretch of highway, so no vehicle records were available. On September 25th, Hollis re-interviewed Brenda Moss and asked her to recount the phone call in as much detail as possible. Brenda said Derek had sounded calm but distracted, as if he were reading from a note. She said he'd asked about the retainer case and then had hung up without saying goodbye. She said the question had seemed strange because Derek hadn't been to her house since July, and the retainer case hadn't existed until Wednesday, September 8th. Hollis asked Brenda if Derek had ever mentioned JT in the context of anything unusual, financial trouble, legal issues, personal conflicts. Brenda said Derek and JT had been friends for years and that she'd never heard of any problems between them. She said JT had been at Derek's apartment a few times over the summer, but she didn't know what they'd been doing. On October 2nd, Hollis obtained a warrant to search Derek's apartment. He found a desk drawer containing bank statements, utility bills, and a spiral notebook. The notebook had handwritten entries dated from May through August 1999. Most of the entries were mundane: grocery lists, reminders to pay bills, notes about equipment repairs. But one entry, dated August 20th, read, "JT says, we need to be smart about timing. Better to go early and come back clean than wait and risk overlap." Hollis couldn't determine what timing referred to, but the phrase "come back clean" suggested Derek and JT had been planning something. On October 10th, Hollis interviewed Derek's co-workers at the paper mill. One of them, a machinist named Lou Kern, said Derek had taken 2 weeks of vacation in late August and had mentioned he was working on a side project with JT. Lou didn't know any details. Hollis requested Derek's vacation records. The mill's HR department confirmed Derek had taken vacation from August 23rd through September 3rd. Hollis asked if Derek had traveled during that time. HR didn't have that information. On October 18th, Hollis received a call from a woman named Ellen Caldwell, JT's ex-wife. Ellen said she'd been contacted by a friend who'd seen a news story about the missing divers. Ellen said JT had called her on September 11th, sometime in the evening, and had asked her if their son, Tyler, still played baseball on Saturdays. Ellen had said yes. Tyler had a game every Saturday at 10 a.m. JT had said thanks and hung up. Ellen told Hollis the call had been brief and strange, similar to the call Brenda had described. Hollis asked if Ellen had caller ID. She said no, but she assumed the call had come from JT's cell phone. Hollis requested JT's cell phone records. The carrier said JT's account had been closed on September 15th, and records older than 30 days were archived offsite. On November 3rd, Hollis obtained JT's archived phone records. The records showed that JT's cell phone had been turned off from 6 p.m. on September 11th through 8 a.m. on September 13th. There were no calls placed or received during that window. Hollis requested tower data for JT's phone on September 10th and 11th. The phone had last pinged a tower near Lake Coeur d'Alene at 5:41 p.m. on September 11th. The phone had not pinged any tower after that time until it was turned back on at 8:14 a.m. on September 13th, at which point it pinged a tower in Lewiston. On November 20th, Hollis re-interviewed Glenn Hoffman, the camper who'd been at Site 15. Glenn said he'd seen Derek and JT loading their truck around 6 p.m. on Saturday, and they'd told him they were leaving that evening. Hollis asked if Glenn had seen them drive away. Glenn said he'd gone back to his campsite and hadn't watched them leave, but he'd assumed they'd gone because the site was empty when he checked around 7 p.m. Hollis drove to Pinewood Shores and walked the campground. He noticed that Site 14 was not visible from the office or from the main road. A vehicle parked at Site 14 could remain there for hours without being noticed by staff or other campers. On December 5th, Hollis requested a search warrant for the rest area on Interstate 90, where the payphone call had been placed. A team of investigators searched the area and found nothing of evidentiary value. The payphone itself had been removed in 2001 during a facility upgrade. On December 18th, Hollis received a tip from a man who identified himself as a truck driver. The man said he'd been at the same rest area on the night of September 11th, 1999, and had seen two men standing near the payphone around midnight. He said one of the men had been wearing a dark jacket and jeans, and the other had been wearing a light-colored shirt. The truck driver said he hadn't thought anything of it at the time, but had remembered the men after seeing a news story about the missing divers. Hollis asked the truck driver if he could provide any additional details. The man said he'd only seen the men for a few seconds and couldn't describe their faces. He said he'd been parked about 50 yards away and had been eating a sandwich. On January 12, 2000, Hollis received a letter postmarked from Seattle. The letter was typed and unsigned. It read, "Derek and JT are fine. They needed to start over. Stop looking." The envelope had no return address. Hollis sent the letter to a lab for fingerprint analysis. No usable prints were found. On February 8, 2000, Hollis interviewed a clerk at a sporting goods store in Lewiston. The clerk said JT had purchased 2 sleeping bags and a propane stove in early August 1999. The clerk remembered the transaction because JT had paid in cash and had asked for a receipt without any personal information on it. Hollis requested sales records from the store. The transaction was dated August 7, 1999. The total was $287. The receipt listed no customer name. On March 15, 2000, the case was classified as a cold case and transferred to the Idaho State Police. A detective named Maria Ortiz reviewed the file and conducted follow-up interviews with Brenda Moss and Ellen Caldwell. Neither woman had received any further communication from Derek or JT. In 2003, a hiker found a wallet in a creek bed near the Montana-Idaho border, approximately 90 miles east of Lake Coeur d'Alene. The wallet contained a driver's license belonging to Derek Moss. The license was water damaged but still legible. Inside the wallet was a single dollar bill and a receipt from a gas station in Coeur d'Alene, dated September 11, 1999, time-stamped 7:52 p.m. The receipt showed a purchase of $32.18, 10 gallons of regular unleaded gasoline and a pack of cigarettes. The wallet and receipt were logged as evidence and sent to the state lab. DNA testing found no biological material on the wallet other than trace amounts consistent with prolonged water exposure. In 2007, Ellen Caldwell received a birthday card for her son, Tyler. The card was postmarked from Portland, Oregon, and had no return address. Inside was a $20 bill and a handwritten note. "Tell Tyler I'm proud of him." The handwriting matched samples of JT's writing from his employment records. Ellen called Detective Ortiz. Ortiz contacted the Portland Police Department and requested surveillance footage from post offices in the area. The footage had been overwritten. In 2011, a kayaker found a rusted spear gun lodged in a submerged log near the south shore of Lake Coeur d'Alene, approximately 5 miles from Pinewood Shores. The spear gun was identified by serial number as one of the two rented by Derek and JT in 1999. No other equipment was found. In 2015, a volunteer named Hannah Pruitt was digitizing old campground records for the Kootenai County Historical Society. She scanned the sign-in and sign-out logs from Pinewood Shores and noticed the entry for Derek and JT on September 12, 1999. The entry showed they'd signed out at 6:22 a.m. Hannah cross-referenced the entry with other records and found the marina receipt showing the boat had been returned at 9:40 p.m. on September 11th. She calculated the time gap 8 hours and 42 minutes between the boat's return and the campground checkout. Hannah called the Kootenai County Sheriff's Office and reported the discrepancy. A deputy reviewed the file and forwarded it to Detective Ortiz. Ortiz reopened the case and requested a fresh examination of all physical evidence. On June 10, 2015, Ortiz drove to Pinewood Shores and interviewed the current manager, a woman named Carol Dietz. Carol said the campground had changed ownership in 2005 and that most of the old records had been archived or discarded. She said the checkout log from 1999 was no longer on site but might be in storage at the county clerk's office. Ortiz requested access to the archived logs. The clerk's office located the notebook and sent it to Ortiz. She examined the sign-out entries for September 12, 1999. Derek's signature appeared on line 14, followed by JT's on line 15. Both signatures were dated September 12, and the time written next to Derek's name was 6:22 a.m. Ortiz sent the notebook to a forensic handwriting analyst. The analyst compared the signatures to known samples of Derek and JT's handwriting. The analyst concluded that Derek's signature was consistent with his natural hand, but that JT's signature showed signs of hesitation, as if the writer had been nervous or distracted. Ortiz requested a second opinion from a different analyst. The second analyst agreed that Derek's signature appeared authentic, but noted that the ink used for both signatures was from the same pen, suggesting the entries had been made at the same time by the same person or in rapid succession. In August 2015, Ortiz re-interviewed Amy Brennan, the campground clerk from 1999. Amy, now in her late 30s, said she remembered Derek and JT, but didn't recall seeing them on Sunday morning. She said the office was closed on Sundays, and campers were supposed to drop their keys in a lockbox and sign out on their own. Ortiz asked if it was possible for someone to sign out without actually leaving the campground. Amy said yes. The sign-out log was unmonitored, and there was no way to verify that campers had actually departed at the times they'd written. In September 2015, Ortiz obtained Derek's cell phone records from 1999. Derek's phone had been active through September 11th, but had not been used after 6:17 p.m. that day. The last call Derek had made was to a number registered to a pizza restaurant in Coeur d'Alene. The call had lasted 43 seconds. Ortiz contacted the restaurant, which was still in business. The owner said they didn't keep records from 1999 and had no way to verify what the call had been about. In October 2015, Ortiz reviewed the gas station receipt found in Derek's wallet. The receipt was dated September 11, 1999, and time-stamped 7:52 p.m. The station was located on Highway 95, 6 miles south of Coeur d'Alene. Ortiz calculated the drive time from Pinewood Shores to the gas station, approximately 14 minutes. If Derek had left the campground at 6:34 p.m., as the launch log suggested, he would have arrived at the gas station by 6:50 p.m., more than an hour before the receipt was time-stamped. But if Derek had left the marina at 9:40 p.m., as the receipt indicated, he would have arrived at the gas station by 9:55 p.m., not 7:52 p.m. Ortiz requested surveillance footage from the gas station for September 11, 1999. The station had been demolished and rebuilt in 2008, and no footage from 1999 was available. In November 2015, Ortiz re-interviewed Pete Rucker, the harbor master. Pete, now in his late 70s, said he remembered Derek and JT but couldn't recall the exact details of their boat return. He said he'd written 6:34 p.m. in the launch log, but acknowledged he might have made a mistake. Ortiz asked Pete if he'd seen Derek or JT after they returned the boat. Pete said no, he'd been busy closing the marina and hadn't paid attention to where they'd gone. In December 2015, Ortiz received a call from a man who identified himself as a former neighbor of JT's, had mentioned, in casual conversation sometime in 1998, that he was working on a plan to disappear and that he'd been studying how people successfully started new lives without being traced. Ortiz asked the neighbor if JT had mentioned any specifics. The neighbor said no, but he'd assumed JT was joking or venting frustration about financial problems. In January 2016, Ortiz obtained JT's financial records from 1998 and 1999. The record showed that JT had withdrawn $12,000 in cash from his savings account between May and August 1999. There was no record of what he'd done with the money. Ortiz also found that Derek had withdrawn $8,500 in cash from his account during the same period. Neither man had made any large purchases or deposits that would account for the withdrawals. In February 2016, Ortiz requested a search of missing person databases for anyone matching Derek or JT's descriptions who had been reported in other states after September 1999. No matches were found. In March 2016, Ortiz compiled her findings into a supplemental report. The report noted the following inconsistencies: the 3-hour gap between the marina receipt and the launch log, the 8-hour gap between the boat's return and the campground sign-out, the payphone call from a rest area 40 miles away at 11:50 p.m., the gas station receipt time-stamped at 7:52 p.m., Derek's question to his ex-wife about a retainer case that didn't exist until 3 days before the trip, and the $20,500 in combined cash withdrawals by Derek and JT in the months before the trip. The report concluded that Derek and JT had likely planned their disappearance in advance, that they had used the spearfishing trip as a cover, and that they had executed the plan during the 3-hour window between returning the boat and signing out of the campground. The report further concluded that the payphone call and the gas station receipt suggested Derek had driven inland after leaving the marina, possibly to meet someone or to stage evidence, and that he had returned to the campground early Sunday morning to sign out and create the appearance of a normal departure. The district attorney reviewed the report and determined there was insufficient evidence to support criminal charges or to declare Derek and JT legally dead. The case remained open pending. In April 2016, Ortiz's final note in the file read, "If Derek made the gas station purchase at 7:52 p.m., he would have had to leave the marina no later than 7:38 p.m., 2 hours before the time-stamped receipt shows the boat was returned. The only explanation is that the receipt timestamp is wrong, or Derek returned to the marina twice, but Pete Rucker's log shows only one return, and the receipt printer generates timestamps automatically. If Derek was at the gas station at 7:52 p.m., someone else returned the boat at 9:40 p.m. If someone other than Derek or JT returned their boat to the marina that night, who was it? And why would they have gone to such lengths to obscure a timeline that was already full of gaps?